He has left us. On July 22nd, 2025, the world grew a little quieter. The Prince of Darkness, our wild-eyed icon of rebellion, of madness, of survival, took his final bow, and yet somehow the silence left behind still echoes with his scream. Ozzy Osbourne was never just a singer, he was chaos with a heartbeat, a voice that sounded like thunder cracking open the gates of hell. He was the broken boy from Birmingham who turned his pain into power, who stood on stage like a man possessed, and who, against every odd, outlived his demons until the very end. For over 5 decades, he defied expectations. He was supposed to burn out. He was supposed to disappear. But instead, he became a legend, one who shaped the very bones of heavy metal and left an imprint on every soul that ever screamed along with him. But behind the myth was a man who suffered, who battled addiction, depression, the ghosts of childhood trauma, and the grief of losing those he loved. A man who time and time again was nearly destroyed, but always found a way to rise. And so we ask, how does a man like that survive? How does he keep going, keep giving, keep setting the world ablaze when everything around him tried to pull him under? This is not just a story. This is a requiem. This is the sound of pain turned into legacy, of darkness turned into devotion. This is the life, the fall, the rise, and the eternal fire of Ozzy Osbourne. John Michael Osbourne was born on December 3rd, 1948, in Birmingham, England, a city built on smoke, steel, and the sound of grinding machines. It was a place where life was hard, where the sky was grey, and dreams rarely survived. Ozzy grew up in a working-class family, crammed into a small house with 6 siblings and barely enough to get by. There was no luxury, no silence, no space, just noise, chaos, and the slow churn of factory life. From a young age, John struggled in school. He had dyslexia, and words slipped away from him like shadows. He was mocked, misunderstood, always the outsider. But in the midst of it all, something sparked, a fascination with sound. It started the day he heard the Beatles. The harmonies, the voices, the sheer energy, they didn't just entertain him. They hit him like lightning. From that moment, he soaked up every sound he could find. Music became his escape, his lifeline. After dropping out of school, Ozzy bounced from one dead-end job to another. He cleaned car horns, he worked in a slaughterhouse, he stole to get by. But no matter how far down he sank, music was always there, pulling him back. In 1968, he pinned a strange little notice on a local music shop wall. Ozzy Zig needs gig. It was weird, it was bold, and it worked. That message brought him together with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward. They formed a band called Earth. At first it was blues rock, but it didn't feel right. Not for 4 kids raised in Birmingham's brutal streets. They needed something darker, heavier. They changed their name to Black Sabbath, inspired by a 1963 Italian horror film. And with that, the sound began to shift. Slow, grinding riffs, lyrics about war, death, and the unseen world. And at the center of it, Ozzy's voice, otherworldly, chilling, unforgettable. They weren't just playing songs, they were building a new language. And from this chaos, from this noise, heavy metal was born. Success came fast, and it hit hard. Black Sabbath's self-titled debut was raw, ominous, and unlike anything the world had heard. It didn't just launch a band, it cracked open a portal, a rupture. The beginning of all the noise that would become heavy metal, hard rock, doom, grunge, everything that dared to sound loud, dark, and real. It wasn't just music, it was a mirror held up to a broken world, screaming back louder than anyone dared to before. But it was their second album, Paranoid, that truly made the world tremble. War Pigs, Iron Man, Paranoid. These weren't just songs, they were alarms, born from fear, from paranoia, from a world teetering on the edge of collapse. Ozzy wasn't just performing, he was prophesying. He wasn't warning the world, he was warning himself. That voice, piercing, haunted, unmistakable, became the soundtrack to a generation raised under the shadow of war, nuclear fear, and fractured truths. The band ascended from grimy Birmingham pubs to massive arenas, from outcasts to prophets of doom, and Ozzy, the awkward kid who used to steal meat to survive, was now an icon. Not clean, not polished, but wild, uncontainable, magnetic in his chaos. On stage, he screamed like a man possessed. Off stage, he collapsed into oblivion. The lights would fade, the crowd would disappear, and all that remained was the silence he feared the most. Drugs, alcohol, blackouts. He called it fun, but it was something darker, a man running from shadows, from pressure, from himself. And as the success grew, so did the cracks. The machine kept moving, faster, louder, but the souls inside it were falling apart. Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage. They were brilliant, but behind the music, the brotherhood was fracturing. Cocaine, egos, exhaustion. They tore at the band from the inside. Fights, silence, distance, and Ozzy was drifting. He had become the voice of heavy metal, but the more iconic he became, the more lost he felt. He was still screaming, but nobody was really listening, and soon that voice would be silenced. And in the silence, the legend was born, not from glory, but from the wreckage he left behind. Silence fell, but it didn't last. By 1979, it was over. The voice of Black Sabbath, the madman who had terrified and electrified a generation, was gone. Ozzy Osbourne was fired. Too many missed rehearsals. Too much alcohol. Too much chaos. Even for a band that invented musical chaos. He had been spiraling for years, and they had spiraled with him. But when the tension boiled over, it was Ozzy who got burned. The truth is, they were all falling apart, but someone had to go, and it was Ozzy. One minute he was the Prince of Metal. The next, he was sitting in a hotel room, alone, drinking, watching the walls close in. He would later call it his lowest point. He drank until he couldn't feel. He slept through days. He thought it was the end of everything. Left behind with nothing but a bottle and a flickering television, Ozzy sank into himself. Reality blurred into numbness. Everything felt meaningless. But fate had other plans. Enter Sharon. She saw something in Ozzy that no one else did. Not just the wild man, not just the addict, but the artist, the performer, the force of nature still burning beneath the wreckage. She didn't coddle him, she challenged him. With brutal honesty and fierce belief, she pulled him from the void, dragged him through the haze of addiction, and dared him to believe he could start again. And Ozzy did more than start again. He became a goddamn phoenix. With Randy Rhoads on guitar, young, brilliant, otherworldly, Ozzy's solo debut, Blizzard of Oz, wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection. Ozzy wasn't just alive, he was dangerous again. Together, he and Randy created something electric, melodic, theatrical, and heavy beyond words. Ozzy had found his wings, but he wasn't flying alone anymore. Sharon behind him, Randy beside him, and millions watching as the madman rose from the ashes. Ozzy was no longer the shadow of Black Sabbath, he was his own storm, a madman reborn, a myth reawakened. But fate had one more cruel turn waiting. Success had returned, louder, sharper, more defiant than anyone had dared to believe. Ozzy Osbourne, once dismissed and left behind, was now headlining sold-out arenas, leading a band that set the stage ablaze every single night. And at the center of that flame was something more than just great music. It was a connection. Ozzy and Randy Rhoads weren't simply performer and guitarist, they were soul-bound, two forces colliding in perfect harmony. Randy brought elegance, discipline, and a touch of classical beauty. Ozzy brought raw emotion, wildness, and instinct. Together they created something that felt almost supernatural, a sound where power and poetry lived side by side. Diary of a Madman wasn't just a follow-up album, it was a declaration. Ozzy was no longer chasing shadows from his Sabbath years, he was stepping into his own myth. And Randy, with that golden hair and a guitar that screamed like heaven and hell combined, was the angel lifting him higher, night after night, until it all ended. March 19th, 1982. A plane, a reckless ride, just a moment, and then silence. Randy Rhoads was gone, 24 years old, taken in an instant. Ozzy fell apart. He screamed. He collapsed. He numbed himself with whatever he could find. Because this wasn't just a loss, it was a rupture, a limb torn off, a part of him stolen forever. Years later, Ozzy would say a part of his soul died with Randy. And if you listen closely to the albums that came after, you can hear it. The fire still burns, the madness still swirls, but beneath it all, a quiet grief lingers, a shadow that never leaves. And yet, he carried on, because Sharon held him steady. She pieced together what was left, she rebuilt the madness. The music continued, the legacy expanded, but that first spark, the one that only Randy could ignite, was never truly replaced. Still, Ozzy kept rising, time and time again, because that's who he was. Not just a madman, not just the Prince of Darkness, but a man who had stared death in the face and chose again and again to live. Randy was gone, and nothing felt real anymore. The lights stayed on, the crowds kept screaming, but something inside Ozzy had broken. He didn't just lose a guitarist, he lost a brother, a spark, the last piece of innocence he had left. The 1980s could have been the end, But somehow he kept going, shattered, lost, sedated, but moving. It was Sharon who pulled him from the edge, not just with love, but with resolve. She became his manager, his protector, his second spine when his own could no longer hold him up. In 1983, he returned with Bark at the Moon. It was theatrical, wild, sharp, but beneath the makeup and snarls was a man trying to prove he still mattered. Jake E. Lee took over the guitar, and Ozzy tried to keep the fire burning, tried to outrun the ghosts, but the chaos followed. Alcohol, pills, fights, hospital beds, moments of brilliance blurred by fog. 1986 brought the ultimate sin, a polished, glam-tinged record that some loved and others mocked. Ozzy didn't care. He was still breathing, still selling out arenas. Then came Zakk Wylde, a kid with Southern fire in his hands and lightning in his riffs. Together they released No Rest for the Wicked in 1988. A new chapter, a new sound, and for the first time in years, a glimpse of stability. But behind the scenes, Ozzy was unraveling. In 1989, he was arrested for attempting to strangle Sharon in a drug-induced blackout. He didn't remember it. She didn't walk away. Instead, she helped him check into rehab, because Sharon saw what others didn't. Beneath the madness was a man trying, desperately, to survive himself. The 80s were cruel, but Ozzy Osbourne lived through them, barely. And on the other side, he emerged bruised, but not buried. Something was stirring. The next decade would bring a storm. But before that, he had one more thing to say. No more tears. The 1980s were chaos. But Ozzy Osbourne, he survived. When so many legends fell into silence, into addiction, into death, Ozzy staggered forward, broken but burning. And in 1991, against all odds, he returned with an album that would become one of his most iconic, No More Tears. It wasn't just a title, it was a cry for mercy, a farewell, a rebirth, a man trying to outrun his past through thunderous riffs and melancholic melodies. Zakk Wylde's guitar screamed with youthful fury, while Ozzy's voice, older now heavier, carried the weight of everything he'd lost. No More Tears wasn't about giving up, it was about surviving long enough to mourn. But the music wasn't the end of it. Soon after came the announcement, no more tours. A farewell not just to fans, but maybe to himself. A supposed goodbye before the final curtain could fall on his battered legacy. But we all know Ozzy. He never really says goodbye. Because in the background, orchestrating it all, was Sharon Osbourne, his fiercest protector and the mastermind behind the resurrection. While Ozzy stumbled through interviews and headlines, Sharon worked like a general behind enemy lines, managing his career with surgical precision, shielding him from the storm he had become, and plotting revenge against a world that had turned its back on him. When Lollapalooza refused to book Ozzy, Sharon didn't beg. She built something bigger, Ozzfest. More than a festival, it was a battlefield, a sanctuary for the heavy, the misfits, the outcasts, a touring carnival of chaos that redefined what metal meant in the 90s. Slipknot, System of a Down, Korn, Marilyn Manson, they all came up through Ozzfest. They all owed a debt to the Prince of Darkness. Ozzy wasn't just surviving anymore, he was reshaping the future. And then in 1997, the unthinkable happened. Black Sabbath reunited. Ozzy, Tony, Geezer, Bill, the original four, together again. It wasn't just a tour, it was a resurrection, a reckoning with the past. Old wounds were never fully healed. But for those nights on stage, something ancient and beautiful returned. The riffs, the fire, the darkness, it was all still there. And at the centre of it all stood Ozzy, older, wiser, wounded, but alive, still defying the odds, still raising hell, still writing the next chapter. The end wasn't here yet, but it was coming. You could feel it, like a shadow behind the light. And in that space between farewell and forever, Ozzy Osbourne screamed louder than ever. The world turned a new page, and with it came something no one could have predicted. Ozzy Osbourne had survived it all. The chaos, the addiction, the madness, and now he stood at the edge of a new century. Older, softer spoken, but still unbreakable. Behind the spotlight, time was catching up. His body, battered by decades of drugs, alcohol and relentless touring, began to falter. Tremors, falls, a quad bike accident in 2003 nearly killed him, but he kept going. Even when his hands shook, even when his spine cracked, even when the pain screamed louder than the crowd, he kept going. Parkinson's disease, surgeries, infections, postponed tours, cancellations. He kept going because that's who he was. He never stopped chasing the stage, that sacred place where he wasn't sick, wasn't broken, just Ozzy. Even as awards came flooding in, Grammys, Lifetime Achievement, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he never acted like it was over, until it was. In 2023, he quietly cancelled all remaining tour dates. His spine couldn't hold him anymore, and for the first time, he seemed to accept that maybe, just maybe, this was the end. But Ozzy Osbourne never leaves without a scream. Just when the world thought it had seen the last of him, came the night that changed everything. July 5th, 2025. Villa Park, Birmingham. Back to the beginning. Ozzy, Tony, Geezer, Bill, the original Black Sabbath together for the last time. It wasn't just a concert, it was a requiem written in distortion and light, a closing chapter painted in sweat, fire, and memory, a moment that didn't feel real until it was over. He stood in front of the crowd, his expression full of quiet awe, his voice frail but firm. Thank you for everything. And then, darkness. On July 14th, 2025, the world lost Ozzy Osbourne. But something strange happened. It didn't feel like a death, it felt like a passing into legend, because his voice is still here, in every scream, in every riff, in every kid picking up a guitar and believing that chaos can be beautiful. Ozzy didn't just survive the storm, he was the storm, and now he is the silence after thunder, the echo that never fades, still burning, still howling, forever. He was never supposed to last this long, not the way he lived, not the way he screamed, not the way he burned. But Ozzy Osbourne, the boy from Birmingham, the voice of the voiceless, the madman who turned chaos into poetry, somehow made it all the way. Through hell and heartbreak, through addiction and resurrection, through every fall and every fragile rise, he carried something no one else could, the soul of heavy metal. He didn't just sing to us, he screamed for us. For the misfits, the broken, the lost, for anyone who ever felt too loud for the world or too strange to belong. He gave them a voice, he gave them a place. He made the darkness feel like home, and now he's gone. But listen closely. In the silence between two power chords, in the static of an old vinyl, in the wind outside your window on a sleepless night, you'll still hear him, laughing, wailing, roaring like thunder across time. Because legends don't die, they leave a trail. A fire, a tremor in the bones of every generation that follows. Ozzy Osbourne didn't fade away. He became the silence after the storm, the breath before the lights go out, the eternal echo of everything loud, wild, and real. And to him, from all of us who found ourselves in the madness, thank you for the music, for the mayhem, for the darkness.